Gee, that sure is a lot of buttons. Do we really need all of them? Or could some of them be perhaps combined together, reworked in some way to cover multiple things at once, or perhaps the action could be removed to make space for something else? With 6.5 releasing, the conversation of what new actions are jobs getting in Dawntrail starts to get more and more relevant. A very common problem in this kind of conversation though, is that most jobs flat out don't have space for any more stuff. To that end, I want to discuss ways to reduce the amount of buttons jobs have in Final Fantasy XIV, focusing on specific examples taking into consideration that we want the job to feel as close to the same as possible. Of course, we can always expect that jobs may be significantly altered with the release of a new expansion, but it isn't uncommon for a job to be mostly the same except for having an extra button added or a few new traits. But if we reach a point where there really is no more space to work with, then we will just end up with stacking traits on top of traits to get hilariously overstacked actions that do a bit of everything rather than new cool stuff. Now, to begin, I think we first need to investigate how many buttons the development team considers too many. We can sort of inspect this through some very specific changes that were made to Ninja and Samurai back in patch 6.05 and 6.1 respectively. In patch 6.05, Ninja's Fleeting and Forked Raiju were split into two separate actions. Before this, they both had the Forked Raiju effect, and Forked would turn into Fleeting as a two-step combo. After the change, it is as we have it now, where you can choose between either. To make space for this additional action button, Phantom Kamaitachi was adjusted to instead be a button Bunshin turns into, rather than being a separate button you use once every 90 seconds. This had the interesting effect of maintaining Ninja at 26 actions plus 6 roll actions. In patch 6.1, Samurai lost the Hisatsu Kaiten action, in pursuit of a combination of reducing button bloat and removing unnecessary complexity from the job, if I recall correctly anyway. Now, the removal of Kaiten left Samurai at 26 actions plus 6 roll actions. Notably, there are two jobs left with 27 actions and 6 roll actions, namely Astrologian and Scholar, not including pet management actions like Place and Heal though. After that, we have Dark Knight with 25 actions and 7 roll actions, and Black Mage with 26 actions and 5 roll actions, and of course, let's not forget, Paladin, who actually has 27 actions and 7 roll actions. That is still more than Samurai and Ninja, even if you discount Shield Bash for being considered useless in a lot of situations. However, the specific Ninja and Samurai adjustments, where they both seem to highlight the same upper bound, still gives us an idea of what the development team considers too much. With these sort of ground rules set, we have some jobs that need some deep-loading far more than others, and some jobs that don't really need any help. However, of course, jobs that only have one space left to work with still are in the danger zone, since we have to assume there would be added maybe 2 or even 3 new actions with the new expansion. On that note, we should probably look at Paladin first, which is quite ironic considering it is the most recent job to get a complete rework. My first suggestion is merging Intervention and Holy Sheltron. Now, I think this change should also be accompanied by changing the cooldown of Sheltron to 1 second, similar to other gauge spending OGZDs to prevent you from accidentally double tapping it. Currently, Holy Sheltron's cooldown is 5 seconds, but the only interaction this adds is that it forces a 1 second downtime of the Knight's Resolve damage reduction portion of the effect. Similarly, Intervention has a 10-second cooldown, preventing you from maintaining the damage reduction effect on 2 other players simultaneously. However, in nearly all situations where this could come up, you would use Holy Sheltron and Intervention on your tank partner, meaning both of these cooldown times are mostly meaningless. Another core difference between Holy Sheltron and Intervention is that Holy Sheltron has a reliable, strict 15% plus 15% damage reduction, combining for 27.75%. Intervention is 10% plus 10%, meaning 19%. Unless Rampart or Sentinel is active, in which case it is 20% plus 10%, combining for 28%. As such, combining both into a single button and allowing Holy Sheltron to be used on another player would technically be considered a buff to Paladin in most situations and a very slight nerf in specific situations. But overall, Paladin's gameplay would probably be mostly unchanged. Next, Requiescat enables the use of Confiteor and the Blade combo, so like Bunshin, why not make Requiescat turn into Confiteor and the Blade combo? Now, this wouldn't be perfect, as there are some super specific situations where this would remove some freedom from the job. Let me explain. Requiescat enables you to use Confiteor for 30 seconds, which means Requiescat changing to Confiteor will never be a problem. However, the Blades combo is a totally normal combo sequence, meaning that you have the ludicrously long 30-second combo grace period for each step. Even though, once Requiescat ends, the Blade combo feels rather underwhelming, as on a single target, it just barely outperforms a regular 1-2-3 combo. But despite this, a Paladin could use Confiteor in the very final second of the Confiteor ready effect, and then use Blade of Faith 30 seconds later to still have the combo running when Requiescat is ready again. However, performing any other combo action, such as Fast Blade or Total Eclipse, will cancel the Blades combo, allowing you to step out of the combo should you decide to use Requiescat instead. And this particular situation would leave plenty of opportunities to use Total Eclipse to do so. As such, merging Requiescat with the Confiteor combo would not really impact Paladin very much either. This would leave Paladin at a normal amount of buttons with 25 plus 7 roll actions. In the interest of leaving Paladin with at least a few free slots, I would suggest 2 more adjustments. The first one would be to combine Spirits Within or Expiacion with Circle of Scorn. Essentially, add an AoE and damage over time component to Spirits Within at level 50, and then further increase the single target and AoE component when Expiacion is added. Why this change? While this would reduce the amount of OGCDs Paladin would need every 30 seconds by 1, in nearly all situations where you want to use Circle of Scorn, you also want to use Expiacion, and Paladin is not really lacking in OGCD space, so ultimately, I think Paladin would be affected very little by this change. Another suggestion would be to add another step to the Requiescat nesting doll by having Fight or Flight simply upgrade to Requiescat. To make sure the button can be used without a target, should this be desirable, I would suggest changing Requiescat to instead do AoE damage around the Paladin. This suggestion stems from the same reasoning as the other. Fight or Flight and Requiescat are almost always used back to back, so you hardly ever have reason to separate them. I will admit that both of these last suggestions would have a tangible impact on how Paladin plays, even if the effect isn't huge. Some people might say, but why not just get rid of Shield Bash? While this button feels extremely pointless in most content, it is a significant, unique option Paladin has, which may be relevant when soloing content, or in things like deep dungeons, so getting rid of it would have a huge impact on the job in certain aspects. However, if Shield Bash were to be removed, I think moving Bulwark to a much lower level could help Paladin with some of its low-level problems. With that said, let's move on to Samurai. Here, we simply need to make some space for some new actions, so the job is a bit less daunting. First, I would recommend combining Ikishoten with Namikiri. I don't know why this wasn't done when the Phantom Kamaitachi change was made. Due to Ikishoten's 2-minute cooldown, there is no way that Namikiri into Kaishi Namikiri will ever cause problems as a single button, regardless of how long you hold on to the buttons. Another suggestion, which would be a slight damage buff to Samurai's AoE potential, would be to combine Shoha 1 and Shoha 2. Obviously, you could make this same argument for Shinten and Kyuten, or Guren and Zenye, but of these 3 pairs, I think Shoha would be the one to have the smallest impact on the job if they were merged. This would leave 2 slots open like with the Paladin suggestions. Moving on to Ninja, perhaps a bit weird after its addition, I would actually recommend removing Huraijin and simply change Armor Crush to also apply Huton should it not be active. This could lead to a small damage loss in some situations where being able to immediately restart Huton with Huraijin would be beneficial. But overall, I think this adjustment would be considered beneficial for ninjas in general. My second suggestion, perhaps also quite silly when you think about it, is to get rid of Forked Raiju, the specific variant that rushes you to your target. While this would cost ninjas some mobility in certain situations, I believe ninja will hardly notice losing this action, as the enhanced Shukuchi trait gives you a charge of Shukuchi every time you use Raiton anyway, meaning that you would almost always have the Shukuchi real estate to both Shukuchi to your target and use Fleeting Raiju should you need to. This would, however, as I said, have a tangible impact on ninjas' mobility in certain situations. Next, let's look at Astrologian, although quite briefly, as we already know that Astrologian is expected to be receiving a massive rework in the next expansion anyway. However, with that said, Astrologian has 27 actions. However, honestly, I don't actually count Undraw, and I think neither should you. In fact, that should have been removed yesterday. Next, I would recommend merging the draw and play buttons, and instead give the Astrologian an addition to its job gauge so you can track your draw charges elsewhere. Finally, I think the use cases where Benefic 1 is useful are too niche, so I would recommend having Cure 1 and Benefic 1 automatically upgrade to Cure 2 and Benefic 2 when unlocked. Perhaps rework the free Cure and enhanced Benefic traits to something helpful while we're there. And while we are looking at healers, for Scholar, I would recommend combining Fey Illumination and Fey Blessing in some way. Due to the somewhat awkward lack of synergy between Fey Illumination and most of Scholar's toolkit, I would recommend keeping the magic damage reduction and let the action be a 1-minute cooldown that also heals through Fey Blessing. Next, I would also suggest having Physic naturally upgrade into Adlocurium when it is acquired. However, I would also suggest Scholar learning emergency tactics much sooner to compensate. Finally, and this one might be a big surprise suggestion, but I would recommend merging Aetherflow with Energy Drain, such that as long as you have Aetherflow stacks, the button is Energy Drain. To compensate for the lack of cooldown tracking, I would recommend expanding the Aetherflow gauge with a meter to track this. I also think making Energy Drain spend all remaining Aetherflow would clarify its purpose as a dumping button better, while generally making Scholar's opener slightly less spammy when aiming for max damage. And finally, for Dark Knight, the last job totally on the brink. This job has a lot of semi-unique buttons to deal with, meaning that we can't really remove anything without it clearly impacting the feel of the job in some way. As such, the best I can offer are suggestions that can merge actions that would be used together anyway without affecting the rotation too much. The first of these suggestions would be to combine the Blackest Night and Oblation's effects, meaning that TBN now both gives the shield and a 10% damage reduction effect. In fact, given that TBN costs MP, I would even be inclined to let TBN have 2 charges so you can use it in quick succession, assuming you have the MP. Similarly, the Dark Arts could be allowed to stack up to 2. This would allow Dark Knights to play a lot more around with using their MP strictly for TBN should they want to, without being forced to use Dark Arts immediately when they get it. Obviously, this would change how the job plays defensively quite significantly, but overall, I think it would be for the better, even though Oblation no longer being a separate button can remove some flexibility from the job. The second, and certainly much more controversial suggestion, would be to merge Blood Weapon and Delirium. I realize these 2 buttons being merged into a single effect that does both would look extremely weird and jank. However, I would mainly just suggest increasing the duration of these effects slightly to maybe make the existing openers sort of still work as they are, and then maybe later down the line looking into a way to make them work better together in a unique way. Like Fight or Flight and Requiescat, I feel these 2 1-minute cooldowns that are almost used together in a way just make more sense if you combine them in a way. Now, I realize for some of these jobs the suggestions I made might have a much more severe impact than I actually realize, but I did try to suggest changes in the name of reducing button bloat while trying to preserve the job as close to exactly as it feels right now as I could. With that said, all of the remaining jobs that I did not cover have at most a combined 31 actions between job actions and role actions with Gunbreaker, or at most 30 actions for all remaining jobs. So that way, I feel I leave a lot of space on the floor for you to come up with ideas yourself. What would you do to reduce the button bloat on your favorite jobs? Would you do something different than I suggested? Maybe you want to take a stab at one of the jobs I didn't cover. Either way, I would love to hear your words, share your feelings, and know your thoughts in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, Paladin already had 1 action too many by the argument I posted at the start of the video, before its rework. With the rework, Bulwark was added back into the game after a long hiatus since its removal with the release of Shadowbringers, leading Paladins who certainly have one button too many, even if you were to argue that Shield Badge does not count. However, we can probably agree that for the most part, it would be a bit much to both rework the job in the way it was done, while simultaneously dealing with button bloat.